there are a lot of people who they are leading who have been deeply affected by trauma. A lot of people have experienced really appalling things happen to them, and we need to recognise that, and we need to lead them effectively.
So that's fight, flight, freeze,
or
fawn,
That's right.
which as leaders we need to be familiar with those patterns so that we can lead our teams and lead others through it. We can reflect on ourselves, but also we can have the wisdom to correctly read a situation.
Many of us, when we're trying to make sense of things which are threatening or difficult, we immediately lurch to blame or to endorsement or compliance on both sides. And I think to recognise the explanatory power, and this is why the trauma-informed piece isn't just about tiptoeing around people or saying, there, you must be traumatised. It's actually helping us understand people better in the way that we're wired. Fawn is quite interesting. It helps explain, why do people seem to be flattering this person? Or why do I find myself trying to be super nice to somebody whose behaviours are actually not okay? Why do I feel I can't call them out on it?
One of the things that happens when you lead is that people see you as the figure through which then the lens of their previous experiences of other leaders or past hurts might be layered onto.
When we're thinking about trauma, which is it's a form of grief, many people have had really appalling experiences of authority figures in their life. I am their authority figure. I don't want to be, maybe. I'm uncomfortable with holding this authority, but I am. Then how can I be
stewarding that well
in the kindest and most transparent way possible? As Christian leaders, we are meant to love the image of God in other people. And it's a loving response to treat people as a whole human. You and I have been really talking about that, I think, as I sort of plumbed the trauma journey a little bit, a few months earlier, maybe, to recognise, oh my goodness, this sense of being ashamed, to have your body torn apart, to be mocked, to be betrayed. Naked. That is what Jesus went through, that Jesus is a traumatised saviour. And then what can you do?
Welcome to the Lead podcast. I'm Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, your host. At Lead, together, we explore authentic leadership through open and honest conversations with remarkable people. Usually those people are women, but today we're making an exception to that rule and we're welcoming an extraordinary man to be part of this discussion. Today I'm joined by the Reverend Dr. Francis, who's actually called Frog Orr-Ewing, who also happens to be my husband. He's a great leader. He's an entrepreneur, a university academic, a farmer, a poet, an artist, and a leader who has seen a lot of growth, tremendous growth of the things that he's led. But more importantly than all of that, he's a leader who seeks the good of those he leads in quite a different way from anyone else I've seen operating. Obviously, he's a very key person in my life. And in this podcast together today, we're picking up from where we left off in last week's show. If you haven't heard last week's show, I encourage you to tune into that and listen to that, where we began to dig into and talk about questions around trauma recovery, what it means as leaders to be trauma informed. The Lead podcast is inspired by my book, Lead Like the Real You. And in that book, I write a series of letters from a woman in midlife based on the leadership lessons that I've learned over the last few years, with the idea of what would it have been helpful to know 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And that book does explore some quite difficult topics, vulnerable topics around operating in a toxic environment or coping with mental health difficulties and vulnerabilities, and also this whole question of trauma. So today, again, we're digging into the issue of trauma, and Frog himself is a trauma survivor, a CPTSD survivor, and someone who's done a lot of thinking about this in terms of the psychological dimension, but also the spiritual dimension, and how do we integrate what it means to be trauma-informed into our leadership. So welcome back, Frog.
Thank you.
And We just wanted to pick up again and kick off this next show with that discussion again of those 4 responses to a stressful situation that can characterise quite normal human responses. And those are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So there's everyone, I think most people know about fight or flight. That's, your back's up against the wall and you either fight your way out of it or you flee out of it. The other 2, perhaps slightly less well known, the idea of freezing. When something very, very difficult happens, you're just absolutely frozen to the spot. We might think of the survivor of a sexual assault who is just totally frozen until it's over. Or the other one, which is probably even less well known, is fawn, which is where perhaps in an abusive situation or in a situation where there's a big power differential, the trauma response or the response of the person on the receiving end of abuse is to fawn, to sort of kiss up to or be very, very nice to appease or please the aggressor. So can you give us some examples of what those 4 things look like? Because I think in our leadership, it can help us recognise those trends in ourselves, but also where we're trying to navigate difficult situations and work out what's happening, or we're trying to lead people who've gone through traumatic experiences. Understanding those 4 things is really important, isn't it? Yeah,
so I think the fact they all begin with F has meant that these analyses are much easier for people to try to remember and recollect, and I think that's important. I'm sure there are many other responses, but these 4 really do categorise some big areas of response to threat, I think. And you've already recognised that both as an individual, but also when you're leading others in a group setting or on your own, that information about trying to see, could there be some response to threat and to some reaction to trauma that would help explain what's going on in this situation, either to myself, either on the victim or potentially within the social setting that I'm dealing with. So you drew out the fawn option, often in a kind of more social situation where there are other people involved rather than it just being necessarily one-to-one. And sometimes what you're trying to do in, let's say, an abusive family situation, that you're aware that if you don't handle this threat in an appropriate way, it's not that it will necessarily do badly for you, but it might do badly for somebody else. So how can you keep a lid on an unbalanced situation so that maybe your children or a brother or a sister or somebody else within that family doesn't have something taken out on them? And so there's this kind of very, very instinctual reaction and coping mechanism with threat that we go into really, really closely. Now, it is a survival instinct. So each of these things is actually designed to get us through a difficult circumstance. It's important to not see them as weaknesses per se, but to help navigate. So I think fawn is quite interesting. I think sometimes in social settings, in a church setting, maybe in a home setting, where it helps explain, why do people seem to be flattering this person? Or why do I find myself trying to be super nice to somebody whose behaviours are actually not okay? Why do I feel I can't call them out on it?
Or you might see people who kind of overly manage situations around a difficult or harmful
around
person.
Somebody.
So that you just don't spark off the explosion or the inevitable harmful behaviour. So that can be a form of fawning, can't it?
Yeah, and then I think if I think about an example of the fight mechanism, in some workplaces, quite often, board meetings or even a board meeting of a non-profit or a church or a charity, sometimes when people feel under threat, they'll start to go for other people or sort of attack or fight their way out of a situation. Now, it may be that these are sort of learned behaviours from school bullying or from stuff in the difficult street fighting or whatever it would be, to kind of fight your way out of a difficult situation. But later on, the sort of obviousness of the fight can become slightly submerged in more sophisticated ways. Passive aggression is one of the ways of describing
that's
somebody.
Still actually the fight instinct.
They are fighting, but they're trying to appear as if they're not fighting. And that makes it kind of hard to
Masked,
read. It's very well masked. They don't want to reveal too much about themselves, and they're actually fighting their way out so that they will clothe it in language that sounds nice. I'm just asking some questions. That's a classic English one. You know, I've got a question process here, when actually what they're doing is they're doing a massively violent takedown, but they're just phrasing it in this masked sort of passive language. And so some cultures mask the fight or mask the flight, that they're saying they're bringing up a process issue when actually they're scared.
Yeah. So as we try and understand fight, flight, freeze and fawn as leaders, we feel these are really helpful categories for emerging leaders to be aware of. Why does it matter, both for them personally, but also for the teams that they might be leading? Why is it important to know what these categories are?
I think one part of it is to do with self-understanding, the motivations that I have. When am I acting in a kind of visceral way that's part of my humanity? It may not be even part of my sin per se. It could actually just be part of, I'm dealing with a scary situation here, and where do I hide? You know, what do I revert to? You could be dealing with corporate risk. Yeah. And that if you get it right, everybody wins. But if you get it wrong, there's this fear. And how do you react in those circumstances? So I think it can really affect our ability to lead ourselves and to lead others. Self-knowledge. A self-knowledge.
Firstly,
And then I think the second is a greater allowance, I think, of people's humanity. Somebody's articulating this as an argument. It could be that there's something emotive behind. Don't always assume that somebody's got something emotional behind when actually they've just pointed out a massive flaw in your leadership strategy. It could be the other way around. But I think to just help recognize within our team that people are still humans. And it's sometimes very hard to leave a part of you at home or a part of you in your history and not bring it to work, and vice versa. And sometimes stuff that's stressful at work flows into the home as well. And so I think it's that understanding of self and the understanding of others. This can be really important.
I think I would add a third to that as well, which is about a wisdom to discern what is happening. Because actually a misunderstanding, let's say, of a fawn response, the one I've seen most frequently misunderstood is the fawn response, where someone who has actually been really profoundly harmed by a powerful individual is really nice to them, you know, is on eggshells around them, is really sorting everything out around them, you know, making their world work for them. And so then let's say it comes out that actually that individual had been abused in some way, and people think, well, no, that can't be true because you were so nice to them. You helped them, you know, you had them in your home, they were your friend. And if you don't understand what a fawn response is, there's then this massive disconnect between what you've seen happen and now the discernment that you need as a leader to actually address real harm.
And I think that's become clearer for you, hasn't it? In some of the advocacy work that you've been doing. And a couple of responses.
Really well-intentioned people.
And I think two of the responses, one person would say, that person was nice to them. They can't have been hurt or damaged. You're like, no, they really can be. And then secondly, I think the self-blame piece, which says, how did I let this happen? Why was I nice to them?
Why didn't I do something sooner to stop this
Why was
terrible,
I not alert
heinous
to this and
harm?
to blame them? And I think it's to allow ourselves to put it in this middle category.
Because you're a human being.
You're neither blaming nor are you excusing, but it's explaining. It's an explanatory power rather than necessarily putting moral blame on either side. And I think many of us, when we're trying to make sense of things which are threatening or difficult, we immediately lurch to blame or to endorsement or compliance on both sides. And I think to recognize the explanatory power, and this is why the trauma-informed piece isn't just about tiptoeing around people or saying, there, you must be traumatized. It's actually helping us understand people better in the way that we're wired. A middle category, I think, between affirmation and blame is to say, how do I understand myself and others? I think it's really, really useful.
Fight, flight, freeze,
or fawn. That's right.
Which as leaders, we need to be familiar with those patterns so that we can lead our teams and lead others through it. We can reflect on ourselves, but also we can have the wisdom to correctly read a situation without jumping to a false conclusion.
Yes, and then that level of masking.
Yeah.
Of self-masking.
Yeah, you've got to put culture in there, put the English kind of veneer of...
Yes, and if you're in a situation where everybody can read you perfectly, that's not a good negotiating situation to be in. So I think increasingly in workplaces or other environments where we're trying to handle a political situation, we become more adept at masking.
Yeah.
And the people that we're working with, the high capacity people, mask. And then we also potentially so good at masking it ourselves that we don't even know what we're thinking or feeling.
Okay, so I want to move on to talk about capacity. And you shared in last week's podcast that you are a survivor of CPTSD, traumatic childhood over a prolonged period of time, and I guess the flare-up of that then happening really as an adult, the actual kind of longer-term trauma response happening as an adult. Now, two things can happen with trauma. One is that like the studies show that actually people who've survived trauma have superpower, and I think we should talk about that.
It's one of the phrases that's used.
Yeah. Like actually in leadership and in terms of being a kind and amazing human being, but also in terms of being a really productive person, actually, so often people who've been through trauma are sort of excellent humans, overachievers.
They're overachievers sometimes.
So let's talk about that in a minute. The other side of that coin is that at least for a time, there might be a shocking experience of reduction of capacity.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And that in itself is frightening. So going through trauma and having trauma responses is really frightening. Having the therapy, working the stuff through is frightening. But another element to that, if you're a high capacity person, you have been for years, is experiencing that reduction of capacity. How can leaders process that? And also how can we hang in there for people that we're working with, that we're for, that we're contending for, when they might have a season of reduced capacity? What does that look like?
I think one of the places that this is understood a little bit more probably is around grief, where people recognize that the loss of a loved one will reduce your capacity for a season, that's a good thing. Because somebody really precious and valuable to you has gone and you are diminished as a result. And sometimes in that moment of grief, you realize, I really did value that person, and I'm marking the valuableness and the preciousness of that other person within my life and within my work life. I think we're getting better at recognizing that grief is something that has a bit of a curve to it. Whether you're using the sort of... It takes time. Whether you're using the 5 stages of grief and those kinds of things. And we are helping people navigate those stages within the grief process. I think that's a closer analogy really to trauma.
That's helpful.
That sense of reduced capacity. I liked the way that in the old days, we see pictures in Victorian era of people wearing black for a year.
Frog loves the Victorians, by the way. His doctorate has this whole sort of section on what we can learn from the Victorians. So
it does, and
I'm not
capacity.
Remotely surprised the Victorians have come up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Their handling of risk.
Queen Victoria took it over the top, though, didn't she?
She did. She did it for a very long time.
But a normal Victorian would wear black for a year as a marker that grief doesn't just go like that.
And
like
also,
you're in it.
It's giving a signal to your people around you. I'm still me. But a lot of me is processing.
I'm me in black.
Yes.
It's powerful.
And how do we...
And like everyone knows
Everybody knows it. I'm tracking lament in my life right now. And that's good because I'm a human. I have a capacity to love and a capacity to feel. I think.
And actually, I'd be a horrible, awful human if I didn't care when someone I loved died.
That's right. And I think when we're thinking about trauma, which is it's a form of grief, that it's a very close brother or sister to grief, I think. which has this reduced capacity, and your emotions and are spending a lot of their processing power trying to handle something. And so there's less of you going on.
Can I ask you a difficult but obvious question, which is that how open is it safe to be
I think
in a space of like work and productivity?
Well, the difficulty
and
we have is the lack of patience. So for example, somebody might have 6 weeks where they're allowed to be sick, and at which point they're done. Yeah. And so that lack of patience, I think, is something that we can work with to give a framework, ask somebody if there is a bit of a pathway, help them out. They may be freezing, they may be in distress and unable to answer emails or unable to come to a meeting and tell you what they need out of this situation. And I think it's being able to ask the question to try to create a framework and a pathway, because particularly if that person has been a valuable team member, to recognise that trauma is a journey, it's a pathway to go through, but if it's handled right, you can come out the other side, potentially a better leader than they were before. So the question is how to have patience if you are in that decision making. I think what is currently difficult, and this is the reality of it, is it may well be that you lose your job in that process, that you can't maintain your job and you lose your livelihood and you lose your economic unit, and you're suddenly going from being maybe the main earner to being a dependent for a situation. That's really, really difficult to handle. I think the word of encouragement to say is take maybe the big picture. Is there anything you can do to buy yourself some time, to buy yourself a framework of maybe up to 18 months or so where you realise that you may only be able to work half-time or part-time through that season. And then when you've done the work, your capacity will pick up again. And it may well be that I think you'll be a better leader at the end of this process than you were before. So if you take the curve, if you like, the 5-6 year curve, the person who has taken the time to build a framework of trauma recovery and to put things in place, I think will achieve more over that 5 years, even though in the 18 months, it may look like they've had a big dip. And I think
so
that's
it's kind
the
of worth it then to stand in the gap with people who are experiencing this.
And on a personal level, I would say that's true with you. I would say some of the trauma recovery was about something in sort of recent stuff, but it gave you the chance to interrogate other things and other ways in which you may have worked better as a leader if you hadn't had these responses. And I think working your way through those over a period of a year or so, I can say that you are a better leader now and actually more productive in your work as well as in many other respects. You still have some of the scars, but I think that patience, and I think if you love a person, you'll be patient with them.
That's powerful. But one of the other sides of the trauma coin, which you began to touch on, is that that sense of what people call the superpower, that often highly creative people or extremely productive people, really beautiful humans, are people who've overcome and survived trauma. And it's more than the sum of the parts of just sort of dragging yourself through, surviving. It's like there's almost this enhancement somehow. Can you speak about that for us? Because again, as leaders, I think it's really important to know about that individually, but also in the teams that we lead.
I think there's sort of two parts to it. One part is when you're processing so much in maybe early childhood and that you've managed to still make it, you will have developed skills and expertise to allow you to compensate with areas of weakness. That is really amazing. Now you then maybe have this moment where you find this reduced capacity. You do the work, out the other side, you begin to pick up, I think, again, some of those earlier abilities that got you through, but you have this extra layer. And the extra layer is having worked out a better empathy with others, a much better awareness of self that has gone through this process. And then I think the ability to know and to grow in wisdom, I suppose, about yourself and others and what may be going on within the room. That is really, really important, that we're not just machines. And this kind of rehumanizing actually makes you a better leader, because people are people. They are humans.
Yeah.
And we aren't just treating other people as consumers or other people as cogs in the wheel. So I think the rehumanizing, both of yourself that you would have to have gone through, and the rehumanizing of others, makes you to be a better person who treats humans as real, rounded people in your workplace, whether that's in the caring professions or in your home and family. So I think that sort of empathy and intuition is one of the things people talk about as being like a superpower.
But there's a physiological element to it, isn't there? I remember you sharing about what your therapist had said about the psychologist has said about the brain injury, but just how amazing the human brain is, like to have survived that.
Yeah.
And not just to survive, but to come through as a person who is highly creative and to thrive. Like how incredible the human brain is. I remember thinking, wow, you might have cured cancer if the injury hadn't happened. Like how extraordinary the human brain is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think so. I think one of the things I sort of dwelt on was to pick up some of the things I had discarded that had explanatory power and were part of me that I wasn't able to use in my workplace and use in the sort of highly productive sort of parts of your life. And for me, that was artistry and it was poetry and that creative artistic piece of me, and to reclaim it. So I started writing poems a lot, sometimes 3 or 4 poems in a single day. I think I started encountering parables more and inhabiting things that had symbolic value as well as sort of mechanistic value. Particularly for me on the farm, I called it doing winter's work. So I think I began to take the seasonal approach, a longer framework. I think that's what we were talking about earlier, this patience that you need to have to see human beings within the curve of 18 months to 2 years, not 6 to 8 weeks, and that shorter time frame. And so I think within the farm that we've got, I realized that there was all sorts of work you could do in the winter. I love hedging, I love working on the forest, I love cutting down the trees in the winter. If you do the winter's work, and it's pretty brutal, I broke my nose once hedging when something hit me in the face. But I thought, no, I'm going to do this winter's work, because then when the sap starts to rise, all the work I've done in the winter will suddenly bear fruit.
Yeah, and explosively.
Explosive fruit.
Yeah.
And same with pruning of fruit trees and that kind of thing. And to take that more organic metaphor for what it means to be a productive human being, that fruit trees have moments of pruning and winter where they almost go to sleep, and then they're able to handle a new burst of growth. And I think that was a really helpful analogy for me. I think the other thing was to begin to try to help the body, the soul, and the psyche do the processing time. And for me, that was around practical physical work that I found really helpful.
And that's quite a common thing with trauma recovery, isn't it? That
very common, yes.
Because trauma is an embodied experience, actually the recovery and healing journey can't just be mental thoughts.
No, and it's not just a client-provider thing. No. You don't just sit down with a therapist and they don't just cure you or heal you. They might prescribe you, almost with me, prescribe you digging a hole or planting a garden or spending time gardening. Or for me, I was trying to build a hobbit hut for a little while on the farm, and it didn't go particularly well. But the issue was, as I was doing the work, it allowed a part of my brain to just be focused on where's the trowel going in and to just think of the physicality of that work. And then suddenly, other things started to make sense. I was able to sort of calibrate wounds and hurt and trauma and make sense of things that had gone wrong in the past. And then I think also separate out what I call the difference between exact equivalence and like equivalence, which I found really important. So an exact equivalence is this situation is exactly the same as that situation. Yeah. And therefore, I've encountered this person behaving in this way and it's happened again. They're doing it again. It's exactly the same. That's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with exact equivalence. But to recognize the like equivalence, that this isn't exactly the same as that I experienced, bad betrayal from these types of people or somebody who inhabited that role in the past. Now I'm dealing with somebody different. is this authority figure the same as the authority figure that failed me in the past? For me, lots of appalling bad treatment whilst I was at a boarding school.
Yeah.
And then authority figures who refused to take action, even when I was a vulnerable child.
Even when you're in hospital and there's medical records.
There's medical records, there's hospital, nothing, just cover the whole thing up. And nothing I could do or say would take action. Then later on in life, another authority figure treats you badly, never intervenes to save you, even though you're in a vulnerable position. That overlaying. Yeah. But it took time, even as I was digging a hole, to suddenly think, okay, these aren't exactly the same.
This is not that.
They're not. There's a correlation. There's a resonance. So now, how do I handle this today's situation? Slightly unpicked from the past, but realizing that I am a human being and I can be kind to myself and understand, love that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. But what I'm immediately thinking is for all the leaders listening to this and younger women who are going to rise up into leadership positions, one of the things that happens when you lead is that people see you as the figure through which then the lens of their previous experiences of other leaders or past hurts might be layered onto. So how does being trauma-informed help a leader lead a team who might be, you might have team members who need somehow to have that revelation that this is not that.
And if you're being trained as a psychologist, for example, you'd be told that people... Transference or projection. And I think one of the things is this may be nothing to do with me at all. Yeah. As a leader, this person may be acting in this way, it's nothing to do with me. The second thing is to say, okay, bearing in mind that many people have had really appalling experiences of authority figures in their life. I am their authority figure. I don't want to be, maybe. I'm uncomfortable with holding this authority, but I am. Then how can I be stewarding that well in the kindest and most transparent way possible? And sometimes I've had those conversations and I'll say, I actually haven't done or said the things that you think I have done or said. Can I take you back through this to help people realize? However, that said, you're obviously hurting, and is there anything I can do to make this easier for you? And to kind of almost journey through with them. And you're not their therapist, you're still their boss, and just to kind of maybe give them the framework to say, I'm not going to take this out on you in any way, but could you maybe see somebody on the side? Is there anything I can do as an employer to give you a framework that you may be able to see somebody 6 sessions or something like that, to just... But
also in a way to help yourself detach a bit from that situation might be a healthy thing. Okay, so a couple more questions.
Yes.
Why do leaders need to be trauma informed, and how do they get there?
There are a couple of reasons they need to be. One is there are a lot of people who they are leading who have been deeply affected by trauma. A lot of people have experienced really appalling things happen to them, and we need to recognize that, and we need to lead them effectively. So that would be at a very, very pure level. I think as Christian leaders, we are meant to love the image of God in other people. And it's a loving response to treat people as a whole human.
To care enough to be informed.
And then what can you do? Well, you can have some conversations with some people, ask some questions if you know somebody's been on a bit of a recovery journey and has maybe come out the other side. That's one of the reasons you and I are keen to have these discussions, is to actually say there's some hope on the other side of this, that you can do the work, but spring does follow winter.
But also I love that theme of being curious. So I would say 5 years ago, I was not curious about psychology, really, honestly. Again, a bit judgmental. I didn't feel it was terribly productive, probably. But my eyes have been opened, and now I feel ravenously curious. So if I meet someone and share a bit of my trauma journey with them, often they might share a bit of theirs, and then we talk about what helped, what was your breakthrough? How was EMDR, like discover through conversations.
And I think
be curious.
There's plenty of great books to read. I would always recommend reading Body Keeps the Score as a primary text, if you like. And there's a couple of other books that I've read along the way and ever recommended to other people. But I think the curiosity is to, particularly depending on what your area of professional work is, the trauma-informed application to your workplace
to your specific
might
place.
be different. So there's quite a lot of great reading about trauma-informed education, and particularly educating traumatized children. There's obviously an enormous amount in the healthcare industry, accident and emergencies, and lots of physical trauma.
What about in kind of risk and financial, like risk taking?
Yes, and the capacity to risk taking. That's an area we looked into. I've looked into a little bit myself as well. What is one's capacity to risk? Are we making decisions based on risk, based on trauma, or not? You know, what's going on here? I think the informed piece. There are academic articles and written articles in each of those different career spaces, if you like, that other people have done the application. So I would say start with one of the key primary texts, and then look at the applications, and then thirdly, the scriptures. For me, this has been a revelation. I have found my engagement with the text of scripture has become richer in the last 3 to 4 years
than ever before. Yeah, me too.
And, you know, I used to preach 5 times a week. I would hope that would be something I'd understand. And suddenly I'm realizing, how did I not recognize that over 1/3 of the Psalms are about difficulty, grief, trauma, lament, complaint before God? They're not upbeat. No. How did I reduce my spirituality to a spirituality of high praise and victors and overcoming, when actually so much of the text of Scripture is deeply embodied, deeply serious about how difficult life can be, and suffering, and these beautiful complaints before God. I find the Psalms to be like, I explain, like a train track. If you see a train going in through a tunnel, you don't think to yourself, oh, that's it, that's the end of the train. You say, no, those train tracks are designed to go through the tunnel out the other side. When the train goes through, it comes out the other side. For me, the Psalms are train tracks through the tunnel. And to say to people who are going through really dark moments and dark times, some people listening or even watching to this today, and you are experiencing those visceral emotions that the psalmist talks about. God, where are you so far from me? Where are you, God? Why are bad things happening to good people? And me, I'm one of those good people. Bad things are happening. What about my enemies? All of this. To realize that those words have been put down there, and then you can use those words as train tracks for your soul and process rage. There are some psalms that are shocking. And I found myself, you know, would this happen to my enemies and this? And I was like, those are very impolite emotions to have. These rage-filled psalms. How could those be sacred scripture? But then you're processing extreme betrayal, abuse, moral harm to yourself or to somebody that you love, a child abuser, and what they have done to people. And you begin to experience that rage. And the key thing is, you have the words and you give it to God. You don't deny that rage is an appropriate response to great evil.
I think the Old Testament is amazing, isn't it? I love the fact that, like, clinical psychological description of human response to trauma is what you read in the narrative of the Old Testament. I mean, even the way that, say, the Joseph story, who's traumatized on so many levels, and the emphasis on his physical body and what actually happened, and what those all of the layers of that. It's amazing, isn't it? Or the crucifixion of Jesus, the focus on
our understanding of the crucifixion. You and I have been really talking about that, I think, as I sort of plumbed the trauma journey a little bit, a few months earlier, maybe, to recognize, oh my goodness, this sense of being ashamed, to have your body torn apart, to be mocked, to be betrayed. Naked. That is what Jesus went through, that Jesus is a traumatized savior, that whole bodily abuse and evil that he experienced, he did in our place. Here, do I have an exact equivalent? So interestingly on that, a bit like, not like, the cross is an actual equivalence to somebody going through trauma. One of my favorite paintings is that recognition of There's a Fra Angelico painting, and there's
Fra
another one.
Angelico,
Okay.
Italian monk who painted frescoes on walls in the 1300s in Florence.
That's right, in the San Marco.
Which I only know because I know you.
and there's a picture of him painting himself into the picture and holding onto the cross.
That is
or the
amazing.
Grunwald crucifixion, which is a Lutheran one, which has the body of Christ with a skin disease on it. And it was painted for a leper colony. And the people who were there worshipping were being encouraged to recognize the wounds of Christ, and the suffering in his body was something that the crucified Saviour knew and understood, that there's an actual equivalence, that the cross really is extraordinary in the way that God meets us in our most bleak moments. Even when we're feeling in our physical pain or our emotional pain or our panic attacks, where is God in all of this suffering? To recognize that God has come close to us in the suffering of Christ. So beautiful, so incredible, so revelatory that the gospel is even more relevant to us as we process and take the time to go through suffering than we had recognized before. It's not just a kind of forensic transaction of justification of how we come to heaven. It's this deep, embodied, like mapping of God with a human soul in the cross and saying, I know, I'm with you, I understand, and I get you. It's so incredible. It's so beautiful.
Got 2 more questions. So this is the penultimate one.
Okay.
What does courage mean for leaders in the widespread context of trauma that we find ourselves in the Western world? Remember, this is women who are engaging with this podcast. This is leaders in business, in the law, in education, in all sorts of settings. Obviously, some leaders who are professionally leading in the church as well. But all as Christians, what does it mean to be leaders who lead with courage? Maybe talk about your experience of fear.
Yeah, I think partly as a result of my early childhood trauma, in order to overcome, I stopped fearing for a very, very long time. Like completely didn't experience it. I think we were growing up, you thought maybe you were, a fearedy cat or something. Like, well, maybe I'm just like afraid a lot.
There's something wrong with me because I experience any fear at all. So I didn't realise you didn't experience any fear at all.
No, nothing at all.
No.
So we were in sort of gang warfare situations in Peckham.
And I'd be like, no, don't. Why are you going in and breaking up the knife fight?
Yeah, and I was not bothered by that, but at least wise enough to tell the other people working as youth workers, don't do what I've just done, but I would still do it myself. And then I think to then experience, I just suddenly, as the sort of lid came off my childhood experiences, for whatever reason, it all sort of rose to the surface in about 2018, 19. I suddenly started to experience fear for the first time. And that was really terrifying for me. It was a kind of almost childhood pre-rational fear, like a memory.
But as an adult.
As an adult, experiencing these things in a completely unwanted fashion. Not as if my fear process had just bypassed all of my childhood, my teenage years, my early 20s, and I was suddenly kind of having to fast forward how to handle fear responsibly all in one go over about 2-year period. It was really, really, really difficult. So I think courage is about, it's different for everybody, I think. Is to not just think that courage is one kind of virtue that applies universally across all people. It's going to feel and taste different. The thing to look at, the thing that you don't want to look at, to spend time with a person who, for whatever reason, terrifies you or makes you think of the terrifying thing that's happened in the past. And these courageous acts are going to be related to the thing that that was so fearful for you in the past. So I think that is to kind of build your way up to it. And when you do something like that and you feel utterly shattered afterwards, it may have taken you 10 days, 2 weeks, sometimes several months to bring yourself up to the point where you can actually have that conversation.
Face the
issue, whatever it might be. That is courage. That really is a courageous act for you, rather than just being fearless.
Okay, last question.
Yes.
So the book, Lead Like the Real You,
Yes.
got to get it in there
Absolutely.
a few times,
Yeah.
is a book of letters written from a woman in midlife to women emerging into leadership based on what I wish I could have known.
Yeah.
What would you say to your younger self if you were writing a letter to the younger you, and then think of all those hundreds of wonderful Christian women, hopefully thousands, emerging into God's call on their lives? What would be the one thing you would have wanted to say to your younger self?
I think I would have encouraged my younger self not to be totally shaped by the demands of the task and the demands of the job that I was trying to do professionally. And I would have said to that person, you're allowed to still be creative. You're allowed to still be an artist.
Yeah.
Don't switch off your creativity and your hope and your entrepreneurialism because it is not valued in any way, shape or form by the system that you happen to be working with. And I would have encouraged the younger me to carry on in that space and to create ways in which that could still happen and to be affirmed. So, and I would say to many of, particularly I'm thinking about the more creative, more entrepreneurial women, and maybe a man or two who might be listening, is to recognize that even if you're in a system or a workplace or an institution that doesn't value the creativity and doesn't value any kind of entrepreneurialism, that doesn't mean that is not worth it and that is not valuable. And to try to find a way in which you can exercise that and entertain it and find yourself a support structure to allow that to be a gift to the world, is what I'd say.
Frog Orr-Ewing, thank you so much. That was Lead, the podcast based on the book Lead Like the Real You. Please do join us next week for another conversation where we're going to do a deep dive with a leader, authentic lives, authentic conversations around leadership. Thank you for joining us.